Hello and good afternoon. We are going to go ahead and get started. I want to start by welcoming and thanking you all for joining us today. I am Megan Kearsley with the Court Improvement Program, or CIP for short. Here's a couple housekeeping items I want to cover. First, you were sent the QRTP bench card and a CLE form in an email, last Friday. The bench card is the only handout for this training, as the PowerPoint presentation refers directly to the text on the bench card. Audio and video for all attendees has been disabled for you. To participate, and we encourage you to participate, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The panelists will be pausing at the end of each slide to take questions, which will happen throughout the presentation. You may also use the raise hand feature to let us know that you would like to be unmuted. So you may ask a question aloud. We will unmute you from our end at that point. Please note that this training is being recorded and we will be available online for future viewing. If we're getting close to the end of the scheduled webinar, the panelists will continue past 1 p.m. to finish the presentation. However, feel free to jump off if you have a 1 p.m. appointment or can't stay until the end. You can catch the end when we send out the recording. Again, I am Megan Kearsley with the Court Improvement Program, and just want to mention that this presentation is being delivered in partnership with stakeholders involved in the Family First implementation team. This is one of many presentations. This one in particular has been offered to county attorneys and GALs and will be offered to other stakeholder groups in the future. Thank you again, and I will now turn it to our presenters to get started, starting with Ashley.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ashley Chase with the Office of the Child's Representative. I am a staff attorney and the legislative liaison there, and come to the office from Weld County, where I was a practicing guardian ad litem for over 10 years. And I come to you today not in my role at OCR, but in my role as the co-chair of the Family First Implementation Committee formed in the state of Colorado. Angelina Callis is also with us here. She is our program manager for CDHS for Families First. So she is kind of my phone a friend option here if you ask a question that I don't know the answer to. And then I obviously have Magistrate Lococo here, who most of you know.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this training. I'm Randall Lococo. I'm a magistrate in the 19th, which is Weld County. And I've been a magistrate for 11 years, going through various rotations, including DNN, domestic relations, juvenile delinquency, among others. So I was part of a small subgroup that worked on developing and gave input into this bench card. So I'm looking forward to presenting about this to judicial officers today. As sort of my introductory remarks, I want all of us to believe that this Family First Preservation Services Act and this QRTP type of placement, this just might be the opportunity of a lifetime to finally, after so many years, be focused on making good findings, using lesser restrictive options, and being able to get families what they need. As you spend more time with FFPSA, you will find, I hope, as I have found, these kids are basically going home. Or if they're not going home, they're going to a family member, or they're going to a foster home, and only for a limited period of time. That's, to me anyway, a real drive behind this act. And I think this is a real chance for us as judicial officers to be able to manage that with better information. We're just going to be talking about one very high level of placement right now, the Qualified Residential Treatment Program, or QRTP. But these things that we're talking about, the kind of findings that we're going to need to make, the concepts that are backing and behind FFPSA, these are things that I think are going to work better or make improvements on these cases, mostly DNNs, but Ashley will talk also about delinquency cases. So I'm glad to be here today, and I'm looking forward to sharing this with you guys.
Thanks so much, Magistrate Lococo. So just to preface kind of where we're going today, I always tell everybody when we start with these QRTP or these families first trainings, including this QRTP bench card training, we still don't know what we don't know. So I will not have all the answers to all of the questions. And it's not that I'm uninformed or that my phone friend isn't available. Obviously she is, I already introduced you to her. It's that we still have questions out there. When it comes to implementation of Families First, the work is still happening. We still continue to get information on a daily or weekly basis, both from the federal level and from the state level. So if we have an answer, we will give it to you. If we have an answer, I feel pretty certain that between Angelina and I, we know it. And what we don't know, we'll let you know who's working on it and when we can expect it. So I just like to preface that because I don't want people feeling frustrated that we can't answer every question that might come up. That's just the nature of the beast as we go into this massive update and change to child welfare. Speaking of the implementation team, that team's been together almost 2 years. Initially, as many of you know, Colorado thought we were going to opt in early. There are many reasons why that didn't happen. The most recent opt-in date we had considered was the spring. Obviously, that didn't happen. Many things that we had planned for the spring did not happen this year in 2020. And this implementation certainly was one of those. And there were many reasons behind that, including fiscal considerations, getting information about IMDs, which is Institute for Mental Diseases, and how that interplays with the QRTP. We'll talk about that more a bit later. And just ensuring that we had a few other things ready to go when we hit the ground running. So currently there's not a date in place for implementation. I can tell you that we're not going to implement this month and we are not going to implement next month, but we have to implement prior to October of 2021. So we don't have a time frame yet, but I can tell you the implementation team continues to work really hard to get all the pieces together to make this happen in a really good way and positive way for Colorado. As we go through our slides, I've kind of set up the slideshow to be one topic per slide. So I will make sure I pause at the end of each slide for questions. I know this online format can get a bit awkward trying to figure out how to ask your questions and when to chime in. So we tried to set it up in a way to make that really user-friendly for you. But as Megan mentioned, there's a few different ways you can do that. So with that being said, I'm not pausing for questions on the introductions. We'll dive into the basics and then we'll go from there. So it's been a minute since we talked about Families First for most of us, and I'm not going to go back over the whole federal act, but I just want to remind us about this QRTP and the basics of it. So if you'll recall, this is about 4E funding. So the 4E supported placements after Families First is going to be basically at home with prevention services, with kinship, relatives, family, or in a family foster home. Or the only other sort of congregate care option that will be available for 4E funding under the Act is going to be QRTP, so Qualified Residential Treatment Program. That means that RCCFs, as we know them now, residential treatment facilities or group homes, both group homes and group centers, will not be supported by 4E funding. There are some limited exceptions to that. There are some carve-out populations where that doesn't apply, like pregnant and parenting teens or victims of human trafficking, etc. We're not going to talk about that too much today. We're really going to talk about this QRTP process itself. There are requirements for an RCCF or a current residential treatment facility to become a QRTP. So some of the requirements are that they have to be licensed and accredited. In Colorado, all of our placements are already licensed, so that's not an issue. The accreditation piece is the part that's a little bit different. Many of our really large RCCFs are accredited, like Tennyson. Think of, that size of facility. But some of the smaller, maybe group homes that were group centers trying to become QRTPs, or some of the other QRTP or residential centers are not yet accredited. So that's something that is a little bit expensive, and there's only a few accrediting agencies across the nation. So the wait list to get into that can be a bit of a barrier. I know that we do have quite a few accredited providers here in Colorado and have been trying to think about how to help different providers become accredited if they do want to opt in and become a QRTP. We do have a new licensing category through CDHS for this already. There was a rule package that went through the implementation team that laid out all of these requirements. So we're really set up well to start qualifying these QRTPs under this licensing category. One of the big things is this trauma-informed care. So we hear a lot about this. This is kind of a buzzword in our world right now, but in the licensing requirements, they have to have trauma-informed care. That trauma-informed care has been sort of defined in rule by the Office of Behavioral Health. It was vetted through a variety of people. So it's going to, not just be lip service. They're actually going to hold these treatment facilities accountable to providing this trauma-informed care. And that's from the top to the bottom. So it's not just that the therapeutic providers have to be trauma-informed. It's that the entire staff and facility provide this trauma-informed care. One of the things we're going to talk about a lot today is this independent assessment. This is a big difference to how kids are put into congregate care now versus after Families First. There's going to be this independent assessment and assessor, and we're going to talk a lot about that today because that's obviously going to be something that you are going to rely on and be looking at a lot. So I want to make sure that you have confidence in that system and what it looks like so that you can rely on that information. Obviously, we want this family and siblings involved in treatment, but this federal act now requires it in ways I think are very exciting when it comes to a child's voice and empowering children, but also making sure families are involved in a way that works for them. Obviously, here today, we're here to talk about this court approval piece of it. Hopefully, you'll leave here today with this bench card being a good tool for you to feel confident in that procedure and how it will look. And then, of course, I think what's really exciting as far as systemic impact and maybe not having kids in and out of these systems is the 6 months of aftercare support. That's something not required now. I think in ideal worlds, and in some cases we managed to do that, but now it's going to be a requirement, which is very exciting. So any questions just about the basics of QRTP as we go into this process? There's always an awkward amount of time that I have to figure out how long to pause to let people type or unmute themselves. Magistrate Lococo, while people are doing that, did you have a comment on this one?
I think I just wanted to amplify or point out as we go through today the independent assessment part that we talk about and the court approval part. It's the court approval part where it makes me say things like, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. We've obviously approved and disapproved of a lot of things and have the authority to do that. But this one in particular really vests us with some oversight and some accountability that I like, and I also think is an improvement and is going to be very interesting. The independent assessment, and you'll hear us say this a couple times today, you can and should trust these things. Indeed, we have to give them a considerable amount of weight. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can override them, but we're not trying to train you to pick these things apart. We're actually trying to train you to trust them, rely on them. If there are questions that you want to ask, by all means, and court proceedings and hearings is going to be the place to do that. But we are going to get a lot of information out of these assessments and a lot more detail than I feel like we have received in the past through placement evaluations and or just regular family services plans that come through.
Great points. So I don't see anything in the Q&A quite yet. I'm going to move on to the next slide, but we can always circle back if we need to. So here's the bench card, just a visual of it. Everything in this slideshow is going to be just the language pulled out of the bench card. And we'll talk about it. As Megan said, this slideshow doesn't have anything additional than what you see on the front and back. So it's 2 pages. We're hopeful that this is going to be helpful to you when you're actually on the bench. If you had suggestions for how to change it, or if you find something you think isn't helpful, please let us know. There has already been a version 2. So this picture actually isn't version 2, but the one that you were sent today is version 2. When we were putting this training together, of course, we found the typo that for some reason, dozens of us who looked at it the first time didn't catch, or the third or sixth time. So there was just a small typo in the first one to a statutory site. That's been fixed in the one that you have, just so you know. And we're just going to walk through it literally section by section. I think Magistrate Lococo mentioned that he was on the small group that worked on this. So the Families First implementation team has several work groups. I think we've talked about this in other trainings. One of those work groups was the QRTP work group. That QRTP work group formed this very small legal subgroup that Magistrate Lococo mentioned. We had, judicial officers, county folks, state folks, guardian ad litems, respondent parent counsel, county attorneys. So we kind of tried to get all of those different perspectives in when we formed the bench card. The bench card then went through the QRTP work group for approval. It went through the Families First implementation team for approval. The Senate Bill 94, or the other Senate bill task force looked at it. So quite a few people have looked at this and added into it. So we think that we got to a really good product, and hopefully you feel that way too. I'm not going to really stop for questions on this one. It's just background. So I guess I gave you misinformation at the very beginning. You see how I am? And so I think, Randall, the timeframes here are here on this bench card.
Yep.
And then why don't you walk us through that a little bit?
So I'll apologize a little bit in advance because the bench card is the only show and tell on this one, and I will read a little bit from it, but I'll try not to read from it and just point things out. We hope that this bench card will let you, or at least guide you in picking your hearing dates or your own reviews, or when you ought to be reviewing this case, either with a hearing or otherwise. And hopefully you'll be able to keep track of that the same way or in a similar way that you might keep track of, say, your expedited permanency planning dates or deadlines. This bench card should help you be aware of when those triggers are going to happen and when you should be holding hearings or deadlines by which you need to be holding hearings. But you are going to need to keep track of a couple things like we do now, say with EPP. You're going to need to know the date of the placement. That's a critical date. A lot of things drive off of that date. The age of the youth, because there's a couple of variations on what can happen if a youth gets to the end of a lifetime duration of a QRTP. You're going to want to be aware of at least how to determine, do you have a qualified individual making the recommendation or the report? If this youth has been in a QRT before, there are some lifetime limits. You're going to need to track or pay attention to that, or at least be aware of that. You're going to want to know or be able to parse out how the agency has assembled this family permanency team. Do you have all the right people? And with a youth over 14, you're going to have people that the youth actually gets to pick. What aspects of the family are involved, and when and how were these meetings with the family permanency team held? They have to be at the convenience to the family. So those are just some things that drive timelines, or that could frankly interrupt or interfere with your timelines, that you should want to be aware of or pay attention to. I know, because I've thought of it, there's concern that this type of placement is going to have a lot more hearings or maybe more objections. And that's probably true, but maybe not to the extent that you might have fear about it. At the first initial placement, yes. And I think we can anticipate needing to parse out some time or have some time available for initial placement hearings or objections coming from any or all quarters. We are probably going to need to get used to having some time for that. After that, though, Ashley pointed out to me something when we were talking about this training, that there's only about, I wish it weren't this high, but there's only about 200 people, young people in a RCCF level type of high level placement like this right now in the state. And as we're going to need to be reviewing these things on a regular review basis, after the initial, we should sync up with our other hearings, our perm plan hearings, our regularly scheduled reviews, that maybe there won't be as many hearings. And maybe if we have, so this is the invitation to really get your best court practices teams thinking and working on how do we get some procedures, some expectations in place. Maybe we won't have as many initial ones either, and those can be parsed out elsewhere. But timelines are critical. Start with the blue box that's on your screen right now. The starting date is that date of placement. Almost everything drives off of that. Be aware that you've got to have a hearing within 60 days of that initial placement. There's some exceptions to that, so be aware of that. If a party objects or if the assessment doesn't actually recommend a QRTP, you're going to have a hearing within 30 days. How you're going to pull that off, that would be one of the questions I don't know the answer to, but we need to be aware about a couple of timing pieces, similar to the EPP time pressures that we often feel.
May I jump in here, Magistrate Coco,
go
just
right ahead.
talk a little bit about this initial hearing requirement. So this is going to be a new hearing type for judicial. And I will tell you, when the bill passed, there was a fiscal note attached due to that reality. As Magistrate Lococo said, we have less than 200 kids in congregate care across the state. So not just RCCF, but I think congregate care in general. I could be a little off on that number, but we're going to see that go down, I think, significantly, which will be, but this is going to be a new hearing. The review hearings, as Magistrate Lococo said, should not be in addition. Ideally, those should be happening when you have your regularly scheduled reviews. But this initial hearing, the dates here, I just want to give you a little background to how this happened. So under the federal act, the court has with 60 days from the date of placement. So that's why knowing the date of placement is so important, because that triggers all of these timeframes. So the federal law requires 60 days. In Colorado, to be honest, we felt like that was too long, and we really wanted to shorten timeframes. Under Families First in the federal act, any placement can be supported by 4E funding for up to 14 days. So there was a period of time when we were going to try to get these hearings done within that 14 days. And obviously we backed off of that because of a lot of logistics and practical sort of considerations. But I put that out there because I think having these hearings sooner rather than later is much better for children and families, and is certainly something that we wanted to see happen. I think what you're going to see for best practices and even some rulemaking from the Department of Human Services is that ideally these assessments and everything happening for these QRTP placements are going to happen before the youth is placed, in which case the timeframes won't matter. You know, you'll work all this out prior to them being placed, and that is going to really make this a lot easier for courts and for parties. If, however, there's always those situations where they can't do it ahead of time, it has to happen after the youth is placed. That's what triggers these requirements. So within 60 days, you have to have this court hearing to have this initial approval of the placement. There are two situations in which that 60 days gets shortened to 30. The first would be if the youth or juvenile is already in the QRTP placement and the assessment comes back and says they don't belong there. So none of us that viewed this felt like it was a good idea for youth to be sitting in QRTP placement if they didn't belong and they didn't assess to that level, and that we needed to have a hearing to figure that out sooner rather than later. The second part is if the child, the youth, the juvenile, the family, or the parties object to that placement, then it's going to come in front of the court within that 30 days. So those are the two times when it's going to be done sooner. And hopefully everyone can agree that that would be important. That, I mean, one of the big pushes in Families First, and it's something we've been talking about in Colorado for a long time, is that we don't want kids languishing in these types of placement. Remember, this type of placement is supposed to be acute. It's a get in, get treatment, get stabilized, get out. It's not a place to house kids. It's not a place where they need to remain long-term. I know that's a problem that we have now, but Families First really brings to the forefront that we need to change that.
So with all of us, particularly now in COVID, at least for me, has changed sort of the pacing at which I schedule things. When someone says, or when the bench card says, you have to have a hearing within 30 days, my initial response, and I share with you your angst, is how the heck am I going to pull that off? Or where am I going to do that? So part of this training is to get you warmed up to the idea that you might have to in certain circumstances, and so be aware of that, watch that coming, be aware of that. But then also to just amplify something I said a minute ago and Ashley just alluded to, this is another real opportunity for the leadership that we can provide in our best court practices teams, that we expect certain things, and maybe that is these reports are going to have to come in on a deadline. And whereas maybe some of us in the past, me included, have been a little easy or flexible on deadlines, maybe we're not so easy or flexible on that anymore. We need these documents, we need that assessment, we need the parties to, dare I say, meet and confer beforehand. So just again, there are some testy timelines here that we're just going to need to get used to, and so hopefully the bench card will give you some guidance on that. And I'll just point out a couple other things in the blue box there. We've got some lifetime limits for kids. of different ages, so be aware of the differences there. If the discharge is going to happen, or if you are ending, or you know it's ending, or if you disapprove, the youth needs to leave within 30 days. And how do you track that? We'll talk about that in another slide here in a minute, but after all of that, then there's going to be 6 months of aftercare required. So how do you track that? Some of this can be done paper review, but I would ask or submit, how much of it do you want to do paper review, or how much of it would be appropriate for you to do paper review? Something to think about as well. I think I'm ready to go to slide 5, Ashley, unless we have questions. I see Megan has just popped on.
I've popped up with 2 questions. One is a general question, confirming that we can or cannot share this bench card with their best practice court team.
Yes, this is public now. It's been vetted and approved, so please share widely.
Wonderful. And the second one has to do with the number, Ashley, that you stated, the 200 youth in RCCF or in congregate care. Does that include those in delinquency? I think you said this, but I can't remember.
I think that number includes pre-adjudicated delinquency youth. I don't think that that number includes committed youth.
Okay, wonderful. That's all we've got
Great.
in the Q&A at this point. Thank you.
No problem. And Magistrate Lococo kind of glossed over it, but I just want to say it out loud because I think it is such a change that he mentioned these lifetime timeframes. That means that children, youth, and juvenile under 13 can only be in a QRTP placement for 6 months. That's either consecutive or non-consecutive. So you really do, we'll talk about this a little bit later, need to know a little bit of the history of the youth. You need to really be paying attention to their age and keeping these timeframes in mind, because that 6 months will go by in a flash. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those requirements. If they're over 13, then they can be in for 12 consecutive months or 18 non-consecutive months. So just something to really keep in mind, because that is a big change that we want to make sure people are thinking about and having in their minds. All right.
All right. So I did hit on a couple of things on the previous slide, again, amplifying and just reminding, we have a best court practices team. I know that almost all of us around the state have good functioning teams. Use them, leverage what you already have, and continue to grow that in terms of having this information ahead of time. As Ashley said, we should have all this stuff beforehand. It should be happening as it comes to us or before it comes to us. We'll all be complaining in a couple of years if we're getting all this stuff late and we're trying to scramble at shelter hearings or a first adjudicatory or advisement hearing, and we're just then being told that this kid's been in a QRTP for X amount of days. So there is this deadline for holding an initial. There are these requirements for holding an initial. Be aware of these timelines. And to the extent that there are rough spots or little speed bumps, I submit to all of you, the team is the place to smooth those out. And again, opportunity of a lifetime. This is where we have, I think, a little more power to say, this is the way it's going to be done here in this judicial district, or these are the deadlines we're all going to agree to work with as we talk about it with our team. So who's on the family and permanency team? Again, something to just really pay attention to. And I also agree with Ashley that this feature about having the youth being able to pick, a youth over 14 being able to pick some members of the team, this phrase that is also, I think, pretty popular right now, voice and choice. That's not something that I've seen exercised with a lot of strength in the past, and I think this is going to require that it will be exercised and listened to and heard, and when and how those meetings are happening at the convenience of the family is something that you're going to probably be asked to measure at some point. Was it at their convenience, or how was it at their convenience? So,
Yeah.
Ashley, anything else on this slide?
Yeah, I think the reason we kind of put these, all of this together for the initial placement is the idea would be if you're looking at this sort of checklist prior to that initial hearing date, this will kind of remind you of those requirements that should have taken place prior to anyone stepping foot in the courtroom for this hearing. And I think what it will do is it will help identify potential issues and rectify them ahead of time. So remember, we provided this training to county attorneys, to guardian ad litems already, and really reminded them, you need to be going through this checklist and make sure this stuff is done before you're in court so that you can, have a hearing with all the information and help this time frame, go through without a hitch. We're also going to be training respondent parent counsel on the bench card, state and county workers. We'll probably do trainings more than once, to be honest, about the bench card, just to make sure it really sinks in. But that's the sort of impetus for putting this list in the bench card and together, was so that everybody, all the parties, could really think about this ahead of time and make sure these things are happening the way they're supposed to. Like we said, because of those time limits, it's really important to know if there's been previous QRTP placements. We wanted to make sure county attorneys, guardian ad litems, other parties involved are ready for that question from the bench. So everybody knows what that history is and what those timeframes are. I will tell you, there's obviously in the federal law, there is the ability to ask for extensions from those lifetime timeframes, but it has to be from the director of the Department of Human Services. So there's a process being developed to get that approval when needed. So it will be an option, but obviously it's going to be a bit onerous. So hopefully it's something that we're not going to have to take advantage of very often. And then, like Randall said, really important that the youth gets to pick the team members and that these are held at the time and place convenient for the family. I think that departments have gotten better at that, but it still seems to be trying to accommodate the family within the parameters of what works for the professional team. And I think we're going to have to see a switch in that. That's something that we're going to be training county departments on quite a bit when it comes down to implementation of this. So any questions about this piece here?
We've got a question about if or how this pertains to voluntary placement agreements.
So the interesting thing in Families First is that, any of these placements require court approval. It does have a section in it that says, and I can't remember what it says, like an entity approved by the court can do these things. So we'll talk a little bit later about how ARD can be involved in this. So I would imagine potentially you could use the ARD process, but ideally, if a youth is in a QRTP, that needs to be in front of the court. We really want to push that court approval, court jurisdiction is happening for kids in those placements, that voluntaries maybe should be used on more youth that are in, family placements and things like that. But there is an ARD thing that we'll go over here in a few slides.
Great, thanks. That's what we got today. Perfect.
We're going to move on then to this independent assessment piece, because this is so critical to kind of what Randall was talking about. Sorry, Magistrate Lococo was talking about. When we're working with the implementation team, there's my office, respondent parents office, counties, departments, judicial folks, all kinds of people at the table. And so there's been some really robust conversations around judicial's role in placements and things like that. I think that many of you probably have heard, from departments being unhappy that you weigh in on placements or overrule their expertise. I know from a guardian ad litems perspective, we certainly get a lot of pushback when we take that role on. And so we've had a lot of robust discussion about it. And in the end, we were able to stress how important judicial independence is, how important it is that that this approval is meaningful and that judicial officers can do what they need to do for these kids, that everyone in the courtroom can be heard to make the right decisions. And with Families First in this process, it's equally important that the court feels like they understand this process enough to have confidence in it, that you understand the assessment itself, the tool, the process behind it, to have confidence in it. Because we do the idea behind this is that these recommendations are going to be something we can all rely on. Well, I don't know about you, but the only way I feel like I can rely on something like that is to understand it. And that's part of our purpose in training. So I really encourage whatever questions you have about this now, but also in the future, because I really think it's important for everyone on the bench to have confidence in this process and this assessment, because it's really the linchpin to how this is supposed to work and be different for kids and families. So we have a whole section in the bench card about the independent assessment because of that importance and just because of how vital it is to this initial sort of part of the hearing. So as you know, there has to be an approved tool. The federal law required a tool. The tool had to meet certain requirements. It had to be evidence-based and all of those good things. In Colorado, as many of you know, we've chosen the CANS as our tool. There were a few different tools that we looked at. There was a whole subgroup involved in picking this, and there were a few reasons that we settled on the CANS. It is normed for a variety of populations. It has been, used at length. It's evidence-based. It has data backing it up. Dr. Lyons is the creator of this. He's worked with several states on it. So there was a lot of confidence in the tool and that it measured the things we thought were important, that it had been normed for populations, a variety of populations, which I think is really important as we think about diversity and equity and inclusion. I think they're continuing to work on some of those issues as well. And there are a lot of surrounding states to Colorado that are using the CANS. And so one of the benefits of several states using that same tool is that when it comes to comparing outcomes or data later, we're comparing apples to apples. And I think that's going to give us some really good information about how this is working in Colorado, how it's affecting our children and youth, how that compares to families in other states that are in our region. And that's just going to make us better able to tune this in and move forward. It also has been used by some counties with good success. And there was some information that it could integrate well with some other assessments in certain ways. So there was a lot of thought put into choosing this particular tool in our independent assessment. So obviously the tool is just one piece. The person administering the tool is equally important. So if you'll recall from our Families First primers and things like that, the person who administers the tool has to be an independent person. So not somebody who's with the county department or state department, not somebody who works for the facility, but an independent person that doesn't have any skin in the game, so to speak. They don't have money on the table or anything like that. So this independent assessor is also something that we've worked on significantly. We have an assessment subgroup that's worked on this. There's a key kind of relationship with the Office of Behavioral Health that we'll talk about here when it comes to the independent assessor. But we also did have a bill this past session. So we've had two Families First bills go through the legislature in the last 2 years. This past session, it was Senate Bill 2162. And it did quite a few things, including adding this definition of a qualified individual. So the qualified individual is the person who will do the assessment for QRTP. So they will administer the CANS tool. It's not just the tool, but there's a whole assessment that has to happen. Some of those questions from the previous slide, for instance, that kind of thing. So this individual has to be somebody, again, not an interested party, not a participant in the court. There was some people in a few meetings saying, well, couldn't a guardian ad litem do it? Or couldn't somebody else do it? We were like, no, that can't happen. It needs to be this qualified individual with that, licensed sort of background and who's really free from any conflict. And so again, this is just to help make everybody feel really confident in this process, that this person is somebody we can rely on and this tool is something we can rely on. So in the assessment, these are some of the things that it has to consider. So there are this plays into the findings that are going to have to be made by the court. Everything has to be tied into these short-term and long-term goals of the youth. We want to make sure there's some collateral information involved, that we've taken into account the family or the sibling or the youth and child placement preferences. Was the youth interviewed? If not, why not? These are just some of the questions that you might be asking yourself as you're looking at that assessment, and it should check most of these boxes. One, I think, important piece is whether or not the family agrees with the recommendation that comes out of the assessment has to be documented. And if it does not agree, so the family, let's say, wants the youth to be in QRTP, the assessment says that's not appropriate, it actually needs to state why the preferences of that family and permanency team, including the family, what was not recommended. So like they think this is what needs to happen. This is why it's not clinically, supported by the tool or whatnot. So you'll get, like I think Magistrate Lococo said, some really good information from this assessment. These qualified individuals in Colorado are going to be managed through ASOs. Well, they're going to be administered by ASOs, which is managed through OBH, the Office of Behavioral Health. So if you are familiar with the crazy spaghetti-like map of how the state is lined up and where departments are, OBH is technically under the State Department of Human Services, but they do have other programs that require this independence, like these ASOs that have, some history behind it, have been shown to be independent, has worked that way. So we were able to get approval that managing, using the ASOs through OBH is considered independent. This is not going to be, under the Department of Human Services in a way that causes concern for our federal partners. And there's these entities are doing this now in some other mental health areas. So, how many there are going to be is a question that hasn't been answered yet. Some of that is going to depend on, there's some work now to try to drill down on the numbers a little bit and see how much need there is. And that's going to drive how many different qualified individuals there need to be. They are going to be across the state. The ASOs currently are across the state. So we wanted to make sure, obviously, that we have an assessor available wherever the youth may be, because these timeframes are pretty tight. So all of that has been taken into consideration. I would imagine we have quite a few questions about this one. So I'll pause for questions now. And then Magistrate Lococo, if there's anything you wanted to add, please feel free. Maybe we don't have questions. Megan, do we have any questions?
Sorry about that. We do not.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
People are letting it sink in. I like it. Okay, then we can move forward to the findings. And then if people have questions about this piece, we can circle back to it, certainly.
Finally, the findings. And how do you fit all good stuff on a bench card? Well, we struggled with that in this little subgroup. And so it's, some of the stuff is on both sides of the card, the findings that you need to make. So obviously, as you get into this, spending a little time with the card and just familiarizing yourself with it, because there are some things that are split up in a couple of different places. Now, there's basic findings on the front, and then there are what I refer to as a rubric for more findings and questions and considerations on the back. And on the back is going to be the part where you're going to be able to make detailed support and go ahead and say stuff on the record that is going to support these findings. So the piece on the front, which I think is on your left of the screen right now, giving great weight to the assessment. Basically, number one, QRTP or whatever you're recommending, most effective and appropriate level of care in the least restrictive environment. We have added a third, somewhat intentionally there, consistent with the permanency plan, and this is because of all these other mandatory considerations. Mandatory considerations are going to include the youth-specific long-term and short-term goals. Was the protocol for the assessment used? The strengths of the family and the youth. Let's openly acknowledge that could be two different things. And specific treatment or service needs, along with the length of stay and the youth's preference and the family's preference, again, could be two different things. In addition to what Ashley just said, the recommendation could be a third thing. But anyway, these basic findings need to be made anytime you are either approving or disapproving a QRTP. On the back, the 4 boxes now on the right side of your screen are these detailed other findings or questions that you can ask or you need to answer to yourself when the assessment recommends a QRTP and you approve it, or recommend a QRTP and you disapprove it, doesn't recommend a QRTP and you actually approve it, or doesn't recommend and you go along with that recommendation. So,
it was such an interesting process trying to put this together because, obviously these findings here are the required findings. And so we could have just left it at that. But there were so many pieces to juggle that we really wanted to make this more user-friendly as a tool. And so it's like, such a convoluted paradigm of all these different things that you have to consider. And not everything's always going to match up, like Magistrate Lococo said. So that's why we really did the boxes. I mean, as you can see, it's sort of, this is the column where the court is approving orders, and either you agree, so the court approves and the assessment says yes, or you approve it and the assessment says no, which requires different findings. And vice versa over here. If the court is not approving it, but the assessment says you should have, then you're in this box. If the assessment agrees with you, then you're in this box. So it was sort of interesting trying to figure out, how to make this the most friendly for judicial officers and for everybody to kind of conceptualize, these different areas that we might be in depending on who's doing what.
And this is where I want to depart from the card just for a second to offer you two suggestions to think about. One is, for everyone who has or had a 4 or a 5-year-old or has been around a 4 or a 5-year-old, how many times have you heard that young person say, why? You could say, we're going here. Why? It's time to go to bed. Why? It's time for you to brush your teeth. Why? Imagine that that is what you should be thinking about when you're making a QRTP finding, and say it out loud. Go ahead. I think we need to do better at this. And as an amplification for I think we need to do better at this is, I would invite everyone to read a case that just got published within the last month, or I think approximately 1 month ago. It's the AA case, 2020 Court of Appeals 154. It was on November 5th. We've got to try to do better at making our findings and saying them out loud. When I read that case, I think one perspective on that case is loose, hasty, or this is the way we do things findings, which we've all done and we do because we're under such time pressure. But that doesn't work for the Court of Appeals, at least in this case. And we've got to make statements that directly, logically connect these recommendations with the services that are being provided or the decisions that we're making. And so I do submit that we all, myself included, can improve our skills at making these findings, making these statements, so that you're answering this question, why? There's another perspective on that case. So if just making better findings isn't incentive enough and getting it right with this new law, there's another perspective that I took away from this case is, and even though the Court of Appeals is allowed to do this, particularly on de novo type questions, that was a whole lot of second guessing from a court that wasn't even on the ground. And unless we don't want that to happen or get ourselves into a situation where that's possible, here is the challenge for us and the invitation to just completely keep working on improving our findings and our statements and say, because I'm deciding this, because here's why. And in particular, when you're not approving or if you're deviating from the recommendation on the 4 boxes, if you're departing from what the recommendation is, say why, say what would be better and why you're deviating, because it's required, but it's also just going to make such a better record in that type of situation. So that's my little deviation from the bench card, and just noting that if you don't approve, you've got to say what the basis for the deviation is.
So we actually had this whole deviation box that is above the 4 pieces here. And this was one of those things that was debated at length, that was part of those robust discussions we talked about. And this is where we landed, which is that similar to language found in Article 2, the court shall give great weight to the recommendation in the qualified individual assessment. If the court deviates from the recommendations, there needs to be specific findings of fact. And then there's sort of 4 bullet points under that that are set forth in 19-1-115. Nothing that I think would be surprising to anybody here. But again, as Randall said, on the bench card, you'll see behind here, it actually says here why it deviated from the assessment. Generally, I think it's going to be because there's a problem with the assessment. And I think that will be really important for parties to ensure it doesn't happen in the future, for the departments to know, for us to go back with information to, these assessors and things like that, so that we can kind of do some system improvement as we go and rectify these issues. Because again, this hopefully will be something that is fairly rare. And so I think those factual findings will be really beneficial to the parties and just the system in general. So some of the reasons why, you might deviate under this 19.1.115 is, whether the protocol was followed. So if the protocol is not being followed, obviously that changes the scenario. You don't have the confidence in the process. It hasn't happened the way it's supposed to, or they're not including the family the way they're supposed to, or something of that nature. That would be a reason. You have to consider the strengths and specific treatment or service needs of the child, youth, or family. So it gives you that ability to really individualize your findings and why you're doing what you're doing. Expected length of stay is something that you have to consider. And then the placement preference of the child, youth, or family. So it could be a situation where the recommendation is different than the family, and the court, gives preference to their, what they think and that kind of thing. So there, obviously the court, we want to be able to make these individualized decisions. The hope is that everyone is going to be on the same page. The assessment will be accurate. It will all have included really good procedures and protocols, and we won't have to use the deviation language very often. But if we do, it's here. It's one of those things that was added in that legislative package this last session. Questions, Megan?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
If we have a question, Megan, go ahead.
Yeah, we've got one that came in about so in a situation when a judicial officer finds that QRTP is most appropriate level of care when the qualified assessment doesn't recommend it, does that result in no federal reimbursement to the county under 4E?
Yes.
Can you also speak to the financial piece as an implication for making these decisions? Or a factor in making these decisions?
Yes, you're right. That if we are in this bottom left box where we are placing a youth in a QRTP and it is not supported by the individual assessment, the Department of Human Services will not be eligible for 4E reimbursement. So that will come out of state and county dollars. That I don't know what the language is off the top of my head, but I believe that there's language in the federal law that says that is not to be a consideration. I know in talking about, which is sort of disingenuous, right? Because the whole point of the act is to incentivize certain activities and placements by supporting it with funding. So, I mean, obviously, we don't want youth in QRTP if the assessment doesn't think they belong there, unless there's some pretty significant reasons to do that. I mean, I think that this box is where we will live, hopefully, the least. Because if that individual assessment says this youth doesn't belong there, I think we really need to all of us question ourselves why we would consider putting a youth in that situation, because we know these are not good placements for children and their outcomes in general. So that to put a youth there that really doesn't qualify is concerning. Now, I think that there are reasons why we may end up here because there's a problem with the assessment, or who knows what, we could come up with lots of war stories that would explain how we could end up here. So the hope is that we were here not very frequently. And if we are here, we really have those factual findings backing it up to explain why we had to kind of go here. That being said, I think it was important to the folks working on this that judges should feel empowered to make those hard calls and hard decisions. I mean, obviously, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys have to do that day in and day out, make really hard calls and hard decisions. But we didn't put anything about money in here because we want these things to have teeth, and we want judicial officers to be able to do what they need to do. So, I mean, it's difficult. We deal with this with reasonable efforts as well.
So again, the whole thing is designed that we're not in that box very often. But again, if you're going to go, make sure you can state very clearly and in a nexus kind of way why you're there, so that the stakeholders and the parties can understand and be able to react or respond. And I think the other part about these 4 boxes that went into some of the thinking, or at least I find helpful, is back to the 4th slide, which is the timeline. By answering these questions and knowing what you're going to do next, then you're also going to know when you're going to do things next. So if you don't approve, for example, you're going to need, and the kid's already there, you're going to need to transition out. within 30 days. How do you want to pay attention to that? That's one of those areas that could be done by paper review, but I would ask, do you want to do it by paper review? If you approve, again, you got to do a review within 90 days, but maybe you're going to hold a hearing within 60 and you can review it then. If you discharge, there's the 6 month of aftercare services. The case is still open in front of you, so how do you want to track that and timing for that? So the facts of each case obviously are going to drive some of those decisions, and yes, some of them can be done by paper, but by going through these boxes, you'll also help yourself in being able to schedule those next events.
I think it's going to be interesting too. Like if you were in a situation where you might end up in this bottom left box here, you know, I think that you could probably get the Department of Human Services to jump on some stuff to try to avoid that situation. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in court and with parties in certain situations.
I was going to say too, Ashley, that if we're in that box, again, the importance of making good findings, and maybe why is this any different than a no reasonable efforts finding? Again, a rarity. And one of the strategies promoted by Judge Lowenbach is to start telegraphing early that you might be making a no reasonable efforts finding and start explaining why. And here's what I think might be a reasonable effort, or here's what I'm hearing from the stakeholders through evidence or testimony of what a reasonable effort might be. So again, we're empowered to do it. Just make sure that we can explain it well when we get there. And that is a reminder that when you're making findings for a placement, any placement, we are still required to make reasonable effort findings. One of the things that working on this bench card did for me is I reread 115, and I confess I had not read it in a long time. I thought, I know 115 like the back of my hand. Well, I submit to you that maybe you don't know 115 as well as you think you do. It's worth another read, particularly with the amendments that just got added. So that would be another suggestion.
There were quite a few amendments to 115 in that Senate bill that I mentioned earlier. So I think that's really good advice. So one of the other complicated things about Colorado is that, of course, the way in which, I mean, we're already complicated with our state-run, county-administered situation, which makes implementation of Families First so much more complicated. But in addition, we have, you know, we deal with our juvenile delinquency population quite a bit differently than most other states. So Families First does apply to this population. Our DYS division did at some point, you know, have pretty significant conversations about whether or not they were going to opt into 4E or not. And they decided to continue to opt into 4E, which means that Families First would apply. Obviously, it's not black and white when it comes to delinquency. So we do in our Families First implementation group, we had a work group formed for juvenile justice. So we do have a juvenile justice work group that was formed a little bit later than some of the other work groups that's working on quite a few issues about how to meld these two together, how they're going to work, and what some of the specific needs are for that particular group. Obviously, in Colorado, we also have this massive juvenile justice reform happening. And those of you familiar with that reform, there are a slew of assessments that are going to be required from that. We don't know exactly how these are all going to work together, but what we do know is that we intentionally put quite a few members in our juvenile justice work group for Families First are also members on the implementation team for juvenile justice reform, so that those two systems are talking and thinking about how this integrates and how it impacts each other. So we intentionally had that crossover membership to try to get ahead of some of these complicated issues. And so we don't necessarily have the answers to how that's going to play out, but we can just assure you that we have people who know it's there, that are working on both sides, and will, you know, have this kind of goal at the forefront of making sure these kind of two reform ideas or changes can work together. So this assessment that we're talking about with QRTP, it will be done for youth that are in the juvenile justice system who are going to be placed in a QRTP. So how that plays out in reality would be if you have a committed youth stepping down into like a residential sort of placement, the assessment would be done to that youth, and that process could be followed. Additionally, if you have pre-adjudication or pre-commitment youth that are being placed into QRTPs, they would have the assessment and be following the process. Obviously, if you have a youth who's being sentenced to the Division of Youth Services or commitment, there are overriding principles that are at play. So what I'm trying to say is that this QRTP, like Kansas assessment, isn't going to overrule your sentencing guidelines or commitment to DYS, that kind of thing. It's just, so it doesn't apply to every youth, but it applies in situations throughout juvenile justice and with our delinquency youth, if that makes sense. And then, like I said, so the CANs will be used for that placement, but there may be other assessments at play as well with that juvenile justice reform. And they may decide to use CANs for some of them. I know some of the assessments they're using are different when it comes to probation and some of those things. So there's going to be a few things that I think our judicial officers and parties in our delinquency court are going to have to look at and assess and weigh and that kind of thing. And I think that there will probably be more guidance about how to do that as the two groups work on it going forward. So I have this initial hearing section back up, which we already talked about, because I want to point out this little asterisk. The asterisk is there because of our juvenile justice population. So as many of you know, some of our juvenile justice population, let's say if they're committed, they may not have court oversight. They may not be under the jurisdiction of the court any longer. So the initial hearing may be done by the Administrative Review Division, or ARD, if the juvenile is committed to DYS and no longer under the jurisdiction of the court. This was another area that was hotly debated in a variety of situations and different teams. And the end result was that it was really important to a lot of stakeholders that if a youth is going to be in QRTP, that a court is making those decisions, that they're making that initial approval, they're reviewing it. However, we needed to have some flexibility for youth, certain youth that aren't under the division of the court or something like that. So that's where this language came from. If they are still in court, then the court is doing it. We don't want our ARD youth doing it unless they have to, but ARD can do it if needed. So the first part of the asterisk is related to the initial hearing, that ARD can do it only in these very limited circumstances. The second sentence is about the reviews. So QRTP reviews can be held as ARD reviews rather than court reviews if the parties consent. So again, if the youth is no longer under the jurisdiction of the court, ARD can do it. Or if you do have a case that's in front of the court, ARD can do it if the parties consent. So again, the preference is that this is happening in front of the court whenever possible, but we needed to have some flexibility. I think some of our rural jurisdictions may use the ARD reviews in ways that some of our urban and metro jurisdictions didn't. And so we tried to be accountable to that while also making sure the court really had a strong role in these placements and these reviews. The other piece that is kind of unique to the juvenile justice population is that in the federal act, it actually said, and I always say I should look up the exact verbiage and I never do, but it essentially says implementation of Families First should not be increasing the number of youth in our juvenile justice system. So because we're doing this on the child welfare side, we're doing it on the juvenile justice side as well, their concern was that by some of these changes, they don't want the unintended consequence of like forcing kids into a different system and having more kids in our juvenile justice. And it requires that we report as a state on this in 2026. So in order to do that, we now took the step of adding this requirement to sentencing. So now if you're committing a youth to the Division of Youth Services, then there's an extra specific finding that the court has to make about whether lack of available and appropriate congregate care placements was a contributing factor. So again, the hope is that that is not common. If it is common, we have a big problem and we need to identify and get ahead of it. So this was again added during this last legislative session through that Senate bill that I mentioned. And by putting this into our findings now, the idea is we'll be able to track this and report on it in a way that is helpful prior to 2026 and certainly by 2026. But this is something a lot of our constituents and stakeholders are really interested in making sure it doesn't happen. So I think it's going to be interesting. So that's kind of my short spiel on juvenile justice and how it interplays. Did we have questions on this one, Megan?
We don't have questions on this specific slide. We do have one, if it's okay to ask now, about who's keeping track of the timelines. For example, are there going to be data entry codes in our court case management system to help track the lifetime cap of QRTP?
I'm
So
not aware of codes that are going to go in like a OH out of home placement code or ending out of home placement code, which is, I'm not aware of any of that. Are you, Ashley, on the Eclipse or the JPod side?
I am not aware of it, but I just wrote it down. It's a question I'm going to ask the implementation team. I
Okay.
know that in on the trail side, they've had quite a few trails adjustments and changes to track families first in a variety of ways, and this is one of those ways that I believe trails will be changing or has changed. It's actually launched to track some of this. Although I'm going to double check. I haven't heard about that from the judicial side, but I think it's a great
Yeah.
question. I'll make sure I ask it.
I will endeavor to explore that as well with the clerk of court. Thinking that the clerk of court and the court executives frequently object or resist to adding more codes, particularly in DNN cases where there are already so many. That's what really made me say we probably need to figure out a way to keep track of that ourselves. And I don't know if that's a cheat
Well,
sheet on each case or
I think
something
that
that we're asking a family court facilitator to do or something.
Angelina, you may want to listen to this in particular because I may be making a statement that's totally inaccurate and you're going to have to correct me. I believe that there was progress made on the judicial and trails like interfacing again. I know that used to interface and then there was a problem. I believe that that is close to happening again. And so my guess is that there may be something about that sharing of information that's going to help in this situation. But again, I will have to verify that for sure. And Angelina, did I say anything completely out of line? Angelina may have stepped out for a minute too.
Those systems, I feel like I got an email recently, and we're talking on the very last day of November in 2020, that those systems were restored and reconnected. But what type of timing data we could pull out of that Sanka interface, I honestly don't know, and we should try to explain.
We'll find out. We'll get an answer to that for sure. Great question. Okay. So I'm going to move on to reviews. And then if there's something else, Megan, just go ahead and pop in here. Okay, so we already talked about commitment to use services. So I'm going to get that little section out of here. And we're not going to talk about discharge yet. We're just going to talk about this review section in the bench card. So now the youth is in QRTP. We've had the initial hearing. Everything's plugging along. Again, these reviews have to happen at least every 90 days. As Magistrate Lococo mentioned at the beginning, the hope is that these should be combined with hearings you're already having, your permanency planning hearing, your review hearing. So I think the way the language states it is that it has to happen no less than every 90 days and that it has to be reviewed at every review and QRTP hearing. So if you're having those more frequently, you need to be reviewing the QRTP piece as well. And if you aren't doing those more regularly than 90 days, now you need to start, because if they're in QRTP, you have to be coming in front of the court every 90 days. This should not, ideally, this shouldn't be a lot of additional hearings though. I think for most kids, especially if they're in this kind of level of care, those reviews are happening more frequently. But of course, obviously there are always those exceptions to the rules where maybe you're having your reviews less frequently because they've been in so long or been so stable. So it was interesting. The federal law required the department to provide this like laundry list of information to the court, but it didn't actually say the court had to do anything with it, which was such an interesting way that it was written. So when we talked about that a lot and putting the bench card together, was like, well, we felt pretty strongly that if the department has to provide this information, the court really should be reviewing it. And that obviously is where the backbone of the review came from. So all of these different bullet points here come from that kind of laundry list of things that the federal law requires that counties to report on, with the understanding that we feel like if the counties report on it, the court needs to be looking at it. And that's kind of the backbone of the review hearing. Nothing in here, I think, is as very surprising. But again, starting off right off the bat, making sure we're tracking how long they've been placed. What are our timeframes look like? Discharge planning should begin from the beginning. It shouldn't be something we're scrambling to do at the end. It should be something we're talking about from the beginning. We're always making sure that things are consistent with those short and long-term goals of the child. As we all know, those may change after a child's been in a QRTP for a month. We may have a lot more information about the family, about the child, about, etc. And remember that with Families First, we're not just talking about the child returning to parents. We're also talking about, now we have these prevention services that we're not really talking about today. Those are available to the parents, but they're also available to kin. So if mom and dad aren't there, but aunt with some services could get there, you're tracking more than just parents now. You're tracking the whole continuum of family or foster families that could get prevention services to get them in a place to meet this youth's needs, because you have two people working on it now at once. You have the youth hopefully coming down, getting stable, figuring out their needs, but maybe you also have a family member who's getting up to speed and getting more resources and more information so that they can meet in a place that allows them to be placement. So it's not just linear anymore. You're thinking about multiple people and what they need to get them to the place to meet the needs of this youth. This one, specific treatments and services that will be met for the youth by the QRTP. So again, we're not going to let these kids sit there and not get what they need. If they're sitting in this placement and they're not getting what they need, we need to be talking about that. And these placements need to be responsive to what the kids need, and they need to be providing that, or we need to, think about a different way to do this. This whole kind of languishing and not making progress or not getting the right treatment is no longer part of what RCCF or QRTP is going to be providing to the kids. And obviously, I think there's going to be some learning curves in there, but ideally that's where we get, and I think that's where we have to put pressure on people to get to. Specific efforts made to return home or to a fit and willing relative. That's kind of that paradigm I was just talking about, making sure that not only are you facilitating family and sibling contact, but also that you're integrating them into treatment. And so I think that is a really big piece too. It's no longer just about the kids treatment, it's about the family treatment in order to try to get kids through this process in a better way and able to be with family. So in that federal law that we've been talking about, not sorry, federal law, what am I saying? In that Senate bill that we've been talking about, they did again add another section to 19.1.115 that kind of details this evidence we're talking about for reviews, what has to be submitted, what has to be considered. This bullet point list, I think, is a little easier to digest, but those should be very, consistent. The information should be the same in both. And then, of course, after the reviews, we also have this discharge planning. So documentation, family-based aftercare plan, it's required for a minimum of 6 months. You can't get out from under the 6 months. That is what is required by the federal law. We really want to make sure that that's documented and that that's happening. How it happens is something that's being worked out. So this QRTP work group is still working on pieces of this. It is a requirement for the facility to provide, but there's going to be a lot of partnership happening, because as we know, you may, if you are, somebody in Grand Junction and your youth is placed in Denver for QRTP, to go back to Grand Junction and get your aftercare services could be complicated for that Denver facility. I think one of the benefits of this terrible COVID time is that telehealth and telemedicine is really coming along in a lot of ways. So that may open up some avenues we couldn't have even contemplated when we were originally talking about implementation in Colorado. But more than that, there's going to be some partnership, I think, with the RAIs, so the regional accountability entities through Medicaid. So for Medicaid eligible children to get some of their services that way. There are some really interesting partnerships happening between RCCF. So those of you that have worked with Third Way, I think it was Savio stopped doing residential treatment, and they've started providing more of this after discharge planning or wraparound services, and they're connecting with like Tennyson Center and some of the other agencies that are going to become QRTPs so that they can maybe work in conjunction to provide these services in different places. So there's a lot of interesting ideas that are coalescing, I think, as people are making progress on how this is going to happen. Some things we're going to have to, the county is going to have to do. So I think it's going to be sort of a laundry list of options for how to make sure this happens in a way that works for the family and works in the different regions in our state.
As Ashley said, the responsibility to provide the discharge plan or the aftercare plan is on the QRTP, but under FFPSA, this problem of continuity of care should go away. Again, as Ashley just said, not precisely sure how we're going to pull that off, but I'm looking forward to not hearing this anymore. oh, this kid's coming home, so there's going to be a change in therapist, or this kid's coming home and we've referred them now to a different agency, and then wait until that actually happens. That should go away, or at least slow down. And I think, again, these partnerships and some of this coordination, because now we're required to think about it, should make that better, I hope.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been some partnerships and agencies talking in ways that hasn't happened before. For instance, like HICPUF and Department of Human Services are actually talking about things that have been issues for a long time in ways that they haven't been able to before. So there's been some really good partnership coming out of the implementation work that I think is going to benefit a lot of areas of our continuum, both the placement continuum and services continuum. So it's going to be really interesting. But we do have groups working hard on this piece. Megan, did we have any questions on this?
No specific questions on this process, just one if you're willing to share your PowerPoint.
I am certainly willing to share the PowerPoint. I will give you the caveat that, as you could tell, this was very layered. So if you printed this PowerPoint out, it is difficult to read. That's why we didn't provide the slides, but I have no problem sharing it if somebody thinks that's helpful. I'm not sure it will be as helpful as you think it is, just the way it was designed, certainly. So I put both my information and Magistrate Lococo's information up here because, again, we'd like this to be the first of several trainings. So would love to hear ideas on other aspects you think would be helpful to provide training on. If you're using the bench card or reviewing the bench card and you have questions about it, please reach out. We were both on the small committee that created it, so we can answer, I think, a lot of the background questions on how we got to where we got. And just for general, questions about Families First, I'm available and happy to answer any questions that I can. I really appreciate Magistrate Lococo, your partnership on this and helping us get through it and helping us do this training today. I hope it's helpful for those of you thinking about doing this. I know, again, that we're not implementing yet, but I think on the judicial side, it's imperative for us to feel prepared for these hearings and what to do when it does start. So I don't know when it's going to start, but I know that when it does start, we want to be ready.
I would just also thank you, Ashley, and the small group that we worked with to pull this together, and the robust conversations that we did have, and to CIP and all the other stakeholder groups that are putting this together and working on this training. And to my colleagues, thanks for listening and being ready to try this on and give it our best efforts.
All right, with that, I think that we are done with our presentation for the day. Was there anything else, Megan, that came up? Perfect.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.